would like to ask Chief Harvey Chappell to make a land acknowledgement for us. So Chief, please go ahead.
Ise Xwopokton just want to thank each and everybody. I introduce myself by my traditional name. We come to you from the unceded shared territories of the Coast Salish people here in the Lower Mainland. There's a few of us to mention us all, but my name is Harley Chappell. I'm the elected chief of Semiahmoo First Nation, and I just want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you very much. So tonight's talk is in honor of the Day of Audiovisual Heritage, which was commemorated by the United Nations in 2005. And we have a very interesting group of speakers tonight. And I would like to start introducing our Chief Harley Chappell, who is the First Nations chief of the South Surrey Semiahmoo First Nations. He has a vast understanding of the knowledge in regards to Semiahmoo history and culture. Chief Chappell has been studying the history of the Semiahmoo First Nations for the past 25 years. He is a father of 4 and he has 2 grandsons. The next speaker is Leticia Sanchez. She is the president of the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society. She has worked in the day-to-day museum operations, including the production, curation, and programming of art exhibitions. She is also a member of the BC Museums Association. And then we have Bill Hugh, who is the executive director of Heritage Vancouver Society. He is particularly interested in cultural landscape theory and practice, as well as the role that markets and behaviors play in culture, heritage policy, and social outcomes. In recent years, he has presented on creative interventions in heritage policy and managing change in cultural landscapes. And lastly, we would like to welcome Hugh Ellenwood, who has been the archives manager and community historian at the White Rock Museum and Archives since 2004. In addition to ensuring the long-term preservation and accessibility of the archives collection, he does historical research for the city of White Rock and various local organizations and individuals. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Being here. And as our audience can see, we have a very different backgrounds of experts tonight, which is also reflective of tonight's purpose of this talk, which aims to explore, understand, and also celebrate the value of cultural heritage, and particularly the value of audiovisual heritage. And rather than asking specific questions, I would just like to invite you to talk about your background and how it relates to cultural heritage. Leticia is a little bit under the weather. Thank you for coming, still, being here despite being sick. So I would like to start with Leticia, if you could explain to us about cultural heritage and your background.
Thank you, Uldus. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Asian Heritage Month is celebrated in all Canada, and especially our organization here in Vancouver. We have the mission of bringing all the Asian communities together, and not just Asian, all kind of communities that are interested in Asian art and performance, and learning a little bit more on the many cultures that are understood as Asian, not only Chinese or not only Japanese or Korean, but we have in fact 42 Asian cultures in the world. So we also try to keep the conversation open and to educate through our Asian Heritage Month festival, which is exploration. And Well, we work all year round to keep the conversation open and to keep that commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that's me.
Okay, Chief Harley, would you like to be next?
You know, for me, I kind of came in blind to this. I'll just be honest. But as we started talking, and as I put some time into it, I really started to begin to understand the importance of the preservation of some of our culture and language through audiovisual recordings that have happened, the different ceremonies that were recorded through the generations, and you know, and I'll use the example of I was in a museum one time and we were talking about a repatriation, and some of the elders were kind of scolding the museum, and they asked me to get up and speak, and I said, you know, I said I'm going to take a very different stance on this, because directly in my family, in my community, if one of our elders hadn't taken the time to work with one of the anthropologists that worked the area, we would have lost a whole lot of that parts of our culture, parts of our language, part of that history. So really, I said I understand why our elders did it. I understand how we came to be, and really how we use this as a preservation tool historically to preserve a lot of and document some of the things. And definitely there are some of the things that we don't document, we don't share, we pass down through us being oral tradition, substantially different. But you know, I think it's a neat conversation, and it's a fantastic opportunity just to explore. And definitely in these times of COVID, I think it's really going to change the way we share, and the way we learn, and the way we interact with one another, and us, you know, closing our circle sizes, and closing what we used to do in large gatherings in our longhouses, we're not able to do in this time. So still finding a creative way to be able to do that. But I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, next, Bill.
Oh, hi, thank you. Yeah, so I work for a heritage organization, and traditionally, heritage organizations are generally associated with building preservation. And it's not until at least very recently in Vancouver that there's this idea of intangible heritage becoming popular. Although the difference, to me, I find is very difficult to understand, because I think that, at least for me, all heritage is intangible. Even buildings are intangible because of how we associate our culture or our memories to the building. But the difference that came from the word intangible cultural heritage for UNESCO was that traditionally, because it's a very Eurocentric way of categorizing buildings. You have other countries that came along and said, well, you know, our culture is not necessarily reflected through building preservation, and we have customs, we have languages, we have art, we have dance, food, all these sorts of things became important. And that's the distinction that UNESCO makes, right? But like in our practice, I think still in Vancouver, people are kind of thinking that, okay, building preservation versus intangible heritage. The difference is people have a hard time kind of reconciling the two. So I'm just gonna leave it at that and kind of get into it more later.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks. And Hugh?
Oh, I thanks everyone for your wonderful thoughts. Bill, I'm really intrigued by that intangible heritage. Speaking as an archivist, as someone who's trying to the best of my abilities, my institution's abilities, to preserve these extremely fragile records that are constantly becoming obsolete, especially in this era, in the digital era. It's terrifying when you're presented with these wonderful records from your community, and you're the one tasked with the responsibility of preserving them. You have to, in a lot of ways, try and predict the future. You have to be extremely conservative in your strategies. For example, you can't take any risks with file formats. You have to be firmly conservative, staying right in the middle of the pack. And you have to concentrate on redundancy and all kinds of safeguards to make sure that the collections are properly taken care of. And so I see, well, my relationship with audiovisual heritage is in a way a technical one, because I'm constantly striving to make sure that they're preserved for the future. And there's a misconception in this era of computer and digital records that everything's a lot safer and a lot less expensive to preserve, but that's absolutely not the case. It's the opposite, in fact. So anyone who lost all their emails when their computer crashed knows what I'm talking about. Anyone who thought that their precious wedding photos were safe on a floppy disk knows what I'm talking about. I once asked oh darn, I can't remember his name now. He was from Boston. He was a sort of an American museum information management guru. I asked him, what's the safest, the best way to preserve an email? And he squirmed a bit and he looked at me and then he just said, print it out. It's paper, ink on paper is human readable. It's going to last for thousands of years, depending, of course, on the paper and the ink. But these digital records are so fleeting. So we really live in an interesting time, and I think some of the UN the UN websites on this day, the audiovisual preservation day, is there's some interesting issues, especially in the third world, of fabulous records that are extremely vulnerable. And digitization is so useful in that you can make copies and copies and copies and make it ubiquitous and make it safer that way. But the great danger is different media formats becoming obsolete and not being compatible with operating systems. So I guess that's what goes through my head when I think of this day. And I was at a conference just like this yesterday with several local Lower Mainland archivists. And we were also talking about, in terms of, especially with First Nations, the Musqueam archivist was part of this group, talking about informed consent. And informed consent is an extremely important concept in audiovisual history. You can't just go around recording people, even if they sign a form, and then using the material in, say, exhibits or in keeping it in collections and using it for various publications without revisiting that consent and asking if this is appropriate use for the knowledge and the culture that these people passed on to you. Luckily, I don't have the demanding role that people like Letitia have for curating exhibits. I think takes a lot of talent to do, and my role seems to be mostly just as a collector and a guardian of these records. And I'm very pleased to be able to do it for the community of White Rock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Letitia, go ahead.
No. I was just thinking that we went directly to the core of the topic, and I was thinking of, in more general terms, of what is culture and what is heritage, because sometimes many of the problems that we don't understand how to keep or how to preserve is because for the majority of the people, their understanding of culture and heritage is so volatile, like nobody really understands what it is, exactly what they are talking about. So if they see a cassette or a film and it's not important, and they just destroy the thing, or they said, okay, give it to charity, or, you know. So I think that something that in my case is important is, what is culture? How do we get into this idea of communicating, or being who we are? Culture is our wealth. Culture is who we really are and how we communicate with others in the world. And heritage, and I was thinking about Bill when he was talking about it, and I think that he has a better understanding and a better probably explanation that I have for what culture is and what heritage is, because we can talk about intangible and tangible, and people sometimes they say, like, what is that, or how do you really understand it? So I have my probably dictionary definitions on what culture is and what heritage is, but I would like probably Bill to enlighten us in a very simple way on what is culture and what is tangible and intangible cultural heritage.
I guess that's me.
Well, because I don't want to interrupt there and then make a mistake.
I don't know if I'm the authority on those definitions, but I think culture is very difficult to define. I think culture is it's like water, right? It's everything that's around us, and it shapes us. It shapes our behavior. It shapes how we think. Yeah. I know that. So I think that heritage is representations of culture. I think that a lot of people feel that heritage is culture in the building form. I don't necessarily think that's true. So people use the word tangible heritage or built heritage, meaning that the heritage is in the form of a building or an object, and intangible heritage is not in the form of an object, right? Those are those very simple, basic sort of distinct, you know. But I think even with objects, I think that you know, there's a big intangible aspect to it. I think the way that you know, the field of heritage has been looking at heritage, you know, trying to get away from this very strong idea that heritage is only about saving objects, to move to an idea of saving our relationships to an object. What are the relationships that we have with the object? Becomes a more important sort of focus. And you know, I'm not an expert on this, but you know, looking at, for example, a lot of the indigenous sites, right? Or hearing stories about, you know, there's a very kind of famous story about, you know, indigenous masks, and I'm not the best person to talk about this. Maybe Chief Chappell can talk about this, but I hear, you know, the story that I heard, that the value is not necessarily in the mask as an object, but in the way that it's danced, and that's kind of dependent on the different bands. But you know, I like to defer to the chief on that one.
And for me, you know, when we talk about tangible and non-tangible, you know, we talk about heritage and the importance of maintaining. You know, I use the example. I'll use the example, and I'll stick specifically to my community of Semiahmoo. So, we on the Canadian side, we got down to 16 community members. We were almost an extinct people. We were almost gone. We almost were no longer. And so, you know, for us to be able to maintain and hold on to anything is the most important. And I'll use an example. You know, the last, would have been a year ago, September ago, we did a naming. So our traditional names that were passed down, and my daughter ended up receiving a name that was 14 generations old. So when you think of the last time that name was used, this wasn't a country. It was a very, very different place, and how that person carried themselves, and how that person, the genealogy and the ceremony that went along with that, and us to be able to revitalize that. And when I think of audiovisual heritage, and informed consent is extremely important, because there are so many things that for us in our community we were so close to having torn from our hands or losing, and the importance of us being able to maintain that and hold on to that now. I always talk of nowadays, in today's era, it's language revitalization, bringing back in our area, one of the languages that's almost gone. We have no fluent speakers in our community. So to be able to use these different venues to be able to bring something back, so our children can feel and hold that, and understand more of who they are, right? One of the things that we talk about with heritage and culture is that, oh, it's old. And I said, no, that's who we are today, and that's part of the pieces of the puzzle that allow us to be, I don't want to say different, be unique in today's day and age, and while maintaining that integrity. And for us, there's so many, as you were alluding to, and some of the masks we use and some of the ceremonies that we do, they're specific to certain areas. They're specific to certain families. Their specific songs are specific to certain matriarchal lines. So those are things we do to maintain, and it's I'll use the expression one of my elders told me, and he said, we're an ever evolving culture. And I when I heard that, I didn't really like it. I didn't like what he said. And I said, no, I want to kind of root in the traditional part of our culture. And he said, no, realize that if we never evolved and we never grew, originally our men would use a stone tool or something along those lines, and eventually they use steel or obsidian and then steel. And he goes, don't tell me at any one of those times, if they wouldn't have got their hands on a chainsaw, they wouldn't have used it, because they would have. And it made me realize that yes, we have evolved and we've grown, and we have recordings of songs, and we don't share them all with the world. We maybe share them with our children or our nieces and nephews, and we keep them within our smaller circles. But really still to be able to have that documented, and even if it's just for a period of time, like especially with some of the songs that we are recording, for somebody to be able to, okay, I remember it, I've learned it, I've been able to revitalize it, and now I bring it back to life. Because from our sense, that has what we call Ulee, a life force to it. It has a spirit, if you will. So it's really being able to use technology in a way that fits within our means and our needs, that as preservation or revitalization. I have one of my friends that does language revitalization. He's always trying to dictate old recordings of their elders to try to get some of the words and some of the language that we don't use in today's day and age. So it's really bridging that gap while maintaining a cultural sensitivity towards the importance of why we do this. It's the way our children learn now. I can sit my children down. Like I said, I have 4 children, and you can sit them down and you can show them a video, and you can have different things on there, and they'll understand it. Where I sit them down and I try to share with them and push it into their minds that this is what you need to do, they might not accept that way. So it is different learning styles that we're also working on too. Thank you.
Hugh, would you like to elaborate?
Well, I think we could say from what Bill and Chief Chappell have said that, well, heritage is not an easy thing to define. Maybe there are several parallel concepts. And as I say the word parallel, I think of, an example of the languages being lost and the endeavor to bring them back. Chief Chappell and I are in the History and Heritage Advisory Committee for the City of White Rock. Mm-hmm. And we're, under Harley's leadership, we're talking about adding Semiahmoo names to locations on that map and street signs, and adding the names of, for example, the Little Campbell River, calling it the Tetlu again, its rightful name, and these things coming back, and maybe that's an element of heritage as well. Is a sort of a grander effort to preserve these things that are disappearing, almost disappeared completely, as Chief Chappell was just saying. But again, I keep retreating into this corner. My role, I don't have to think of these lofty concepts. I'm the person that people come to when they say, well, for example, Joanne Charles today of the Semiahmoo people contacted me for a photograph of her relative, David Charles, who was a veteran of the Second World War. And I was very pleased to be able to help out with that. It is a gratifying feeling. I've had researchers moved to tears by an audio recording of a woman, heard a recording that I had of her father, who had been dead for 10 years. And she had never heard his voice, or him, of course she'd heard his voice. She'd never heard him, she hadn't heard his voice for 10 years since he died, and hadn't heard this recording. And it was so moving that she started to cry. And I felt a certain pride at being able to preserve that. And that's I guess my ultimate goal is to be that kind of an institution that people can rely on for preserving their documentary heritage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would mention, for example, I was talking to Catherine Clement. She made the collection of photographs from Yucho Chow, and how important it was for her to find these photographs that had no relation with any other person. They were almost difficult to identify who the families or persons were, but the idea of preserving them and putting them in audiovisual material was very important, because it helped us understand the importance of the culture of that person, or what is behind those photographs, what is behind those, even the position of the photographs and the spaces that are surrounded. And I was fascinated by hearing that she says that, for example, for people from the Sikh community in those days, in the 1800s, they couldn't have their photos taken in a white environment or with a photographer in the mainland. So they used to go to Chinatown to have their photos taken. And Yucho Chow took their photos. Finding the stories behind that tells us about this culture and the world cultural heritage that is so valuable for everybody to keep and maintain. I strongly invite you to see those Yucho Chow photographs and the videos that Catherine Clement put together. And it is amazing to see just the faces and the people there, and trying to imagine what was in those days for them, how they lived, how they felt, if they suffer or not. And I think that preserving all those ideas and people and the presence of people in now and with our kids, it's going to give that legacy to the world.
Mm-hmm. So you actually mentioned something, Letitia, that somebody from a minority did these pictures in the aiming to preserve the culture of a minority group. And I have a question to the chief. So I read that the Museum of Surrey currently is having an exhibition running about Semiahmoo First Nations, but it's also made by the Semiahmoo First Nations. And in this regard, I would like to know, why is it important that exhibitions and other cultural displays are actually organized and led by those whose culture is being shown? Because, like Bill mentioned initially, in the past, the preservation and management and the display of culture used to be very Eurocentric. It was always the white people, if they picked and choose what they want to show and whose culture they want to preserve. But nowadays, there's an understanding, hopefully, that culture shouldn't be, the display of and preservation of culture shouldn't just be done by just a certain dominant group of people in society. So my question to all of you is, why is this important? Oh, yes, sorry, Letitia.
It's okay, it's okay. I think that since culture change, it's in constant change, and it is really difficult to define which one is more important or not. I think that the way we present the visuals, so the way we work with these communities is what will help the mainstream understand the cultures. I don't know if that was your question, but I think that because culture changed so much, and we cannot define how to preserve that heritage. I think that sometimes we get in conflict with that feeling of being a tribal group, and the opportunity to present in an exhibition the richness of different cultures is what makes sense for an exhibition on heritage. But excuse me if I misunderstood the question.
Anyone else?
I think that the Semiahmoo building the exhibit themselves is fantastic. It's in the past, the centuries or even decades in the past, and this is more of a museum's thing, and I'm an archivist, but the idea was of the Eurocentric idea was of some white person collecting a whole bunch of exotic things that they liked and then telling everybody what they meant. And now museums are doing much better than that. And I wish that our curator, Charlene Garvey, was here to be able to tell you about this. She'd be much better at it than I, but now it's you go in and you experience the museum. Almost you're telling the museum what these objects and images mean. I think Bill touched on that earlier with talking about buildings formerly as a concept of heritage, and now it's the relationship of the object. And So I think that's a good shift in our conception of museums.
You know, and I think that's part of the work that we can do is, you know, when we did the museum exhibit there, one of the big stressors that we had from our end is we need to make it that we're not gone, or where we're still alive, we're still here, and starting right from our origin story all the way through to having our young people on video. So you know, one of my elders was one of the ones that shared one of our origin stories, and then we said, well, we want to wrap it up, and she said, well, what are we doing with the kids, with our young people? So we put it out to our children, and so I really wanted to bridge that gap, because I think one of the struggles that we have is that we see museums as historic and gone, and we're trying to preserve within that space, and being able to do that through an audiovisual text it's a way that we can really showcase that we're still here. These people are this culture, regardless of whose culture, it's still alive, it's still well, and that's the beauty that makes up, you know, what we call Canada now, is that diversity and that multiculturalism. You know, I really see that as such a beautiful thing to be celebrated. We're not the melting pot that everybody becomes Canadian. We come here with our own cultures and our languages, and that opportunity to be able to showcase that is the beautiful thing that makes this place so nice.
Yeah, and sorry.
Go ahead.
No.
I just wanted to kind of follow up on what Hugh kind of said there. I don't know if you probably know this example. It's a very famous example in the heritage field. It revolves around a shrine in Japan. It's Ise Shrine in Mie Prefecture. And this is a shrine that the Japanese were saying, this should be considered World Heritage by UNESCO. And UNESCO said, actually, well, no, not really, because it's not old enough, right? And so what they do to the shrine is that they tear it down, I think, every 20 years. And so the Japanese part of it say, well, the heritage is not the building itself. The heritage is us tearing it down every 20 years, teaching another generation how to rebuild it, and them having an experience with that whole process, right? There's like a ceremony. That whole cultural experience is the heritage rather than the building itself. So that's a relatively famous kind of story in our field, but
that's wonderful. That's a wonderful example of that. The ephemeral nature. You know, there was a famous artist who, can't remember his name. All his works he did in chocolate, and of course they would melt or be eaten, and there were people trying to preserve them somehow, and it was his exact intent for it not to be preserved. And well, a large part of our photograph collection is of the Canadian Open Sandcastle competition on the beach in White Rock. And those huge sculptures were completely ephemeral. The next tide would destroy them completely. Meanwhile, it's my job to preserve the photographs of them and the video recordings, the audio recordings of that festival, the experience of that. It's completely gone now, but again, it's the relationship of the people and the objects, and then there's almost this side product of recordings and photographs that maybe even aren't the real essence of heritage. They're just there as reminder notes to us of what real heritage is, which is a living thing between human beings.
And the environment. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that another important part of preserving this heritage is to find this universal culture, because we have lots of differences, but also similarities. And the more we understand other cultures, the more we learn about other cultures, we will understand that we are not alone and that we're not unique, and we cannot just think of our own group as the one who keeps the culture and who's going to be, as we have put it now, colonialist. But understanding and respecting this cultural heritage and learning more about other cultures will help us be more respectful, more kind, and more caring about this cultural heritage, which is humanity in fact. And the preservation, even if it's oral or even if it disappears, it stays in your mind and in your understanding of others. And that is the main objective of any preservation of heritage, the opportunity to see ourselves as humans and belong to this marvelous world and be part of it in a more kind way.
You guys now touched on something. The chief said that we are so fortunate to live in Canada, which is a multicultural nation. And to me, as an immigrant from Germany coming to Canada, I think it's an elevation of living in democracy. So my parents are Persian. They fled their country, Iran. They fled to Germany. And then I moved from Germany to Canada. And I have watched, just as an observer, how, what it means, the connection between democracy, dictatorship, and keeping heritage. So, and actually it does, my personal experience does relate to the audiovisual heritage, because I grew up with a cassette, with an MC of a famous Iranian poem, who was declared the enemy of the current Iranian regime. And this cassette is, I always affiliated with my childhood. And at some point I lost this cassette and I was looking everywhere for it. And I had to understand that probably I will never find this piece of audio heritage again, because the cultural institution that made this cassette back then was a different regime, which was destroyed by the current regime, and the cultural institution was destroyed. And this poet was, considered as an enemy by the current regime. So probably this is gone. And so my question is, in your opinion, how significant is the preservation of cultural heritage, be it tangible or intangible, in the political context, democracy versus dictatorship?
Wow. That is a huge question, but because of intangible heritage changes and culture changes, conflict is pretty much to be there all the time, because what is good for me, I want it to be good for you. So because conflict is going to be something that we cannot avoid, especially war conflict in tangible heritage. There is one person one group that thinks that what the other group has as a culture is not valuable, so they destroy it. How to preserve it? This is a big question, but yeah. Probably, as I said, just by understanding more about our similarities, our differences, it's really hard to preserve heritage that is destroyed by war.
The difficulty with this situation is that you have a regime that is actively trying to make itself look better by destroying the traces, the evidence, the documentary heritage of the previous regime. And it's a constant occurrence over human history, and what we have to do to combat that is to do the best we can to preserve these records. And I haven't faced this situation myself, but even when you're encountered with something that's offensive or that you disagree with politically, you still do your best to preserve it. It's kind of that parallel of that famous statement, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And this goes to the heart of what it is to be an archivist, to have a completely neutral perspective, and your job is to preserve these records, and then you also index them and put certain restrictions on certain records as well, so that things that are offensive but maybe tell us about culture and politics in the past can be preserved and managed, but they won't be lost to history like your cassette was, because that's the worst case scenario.
And there is where oral stories and for example, your story of those is important to preserve, because probably you remember part of that poem, and probably you remember where it was, where you heard about it, and preserving the oral history of the people and the world is what also will help us, even though we lost the original art or the original piece. I think that recording stories and recording what has happened will help future generations to understand and behave better, hopefully.
Yeah, and maybe on this, just one thing I'd like to add is, I always, when I share some of our origin stories, and when I share some of our ancient history, people can't believe it. They say, "How can you believe that? How can you believe that you're the survivor of the flood, that the White Rock came from this area?" And I said, well, I'm very fortunate that it's only been, my history's only been disrupt for the past, couple hundred years, where, if I go to, and I use an example of how many times has a different regime come in, or a different ruler come into a European nation and eradicated the history and the culture that was there previously, where I really see that we've been, I don't want to say fortunate, we've been very, very lucky to hold on to what history we have left, and now we see, okay, if and I'll use the example of this pandemic. We hit the smallpox pandemic, and 90% of our population died. So those were all the storytellers, the historians, the all those people that through an oral tradition were no longer. So in today's day and age, the opportunity to be able to document and share and solidify that for now, and I understand what Hugh said, but really be able to do that, because our connection and our relationship is forever. Where if we document it on paper, okay, that paper can burn, that paper can get wet, that paper can, so it is being mindful of how we go about sharing that and keeping that. But then technology outdates, and you run into all these issues and these struggles, but really be able to, and I'm not going to get into the political realm of that, but but it is really being able to hold on to that. And and I just think, just imagine those opportunities for a great grandchild to hear the same stories that their parents tell them, and see a video of their great grandmother telling the same story. That's a very, very a beautiful thing, and that continuity. And of course that may change over time, but to be able to have that handed down through the generations is you know, that's pure wealth. That's real wealth in my eyes. That's true wealth. And so yeah, that's just a thought on that.
Yeah. So we are almost at 1 hour. There is a nice question from the audience. I'm going to say it out loud. So somebody would like to ask you all about language, how crucial it is to culture and can affect our worldview. I have been fascinated by what Bill said, that culture is like water, how it is all around us. I have come to see that the world we live in is made of language and culture. Perhaps Chief Harley can tell us more about the languages of the past, how they are different from modern English and hold a different worldview.
Well, it's quite easy because first off, we never spoke English. No. But you know, I'll use the example, and it is through these COVID times. You know, we've changed the way we're doing business, and me personally, being able to pre-COVID, I was traveling to Lummi, which is just out of Bellingham, and sitting with one of our elders and doing language with him twice a week. So I was doing probably about 2.5 to 3 hours of travel to try to set some foundation for our language. And when I say our language, it's and this is where audiovisual technology will help so much in the revitalization of language, because for the Semiahmoo language, our relatives in language are the Saanich people and the Lummi people. So that is either a ferry ride away or across the border, half an hour into the U.S. into the United States. So I was choosing to go to see one of our elders in Lummi. COVID hit, borders closed. Then shortly after I get an email and they say, hey, we're going to start Zoom classes twice a week. And I went, yes. So now I can sit in the comfort of my own home and do language class. And, we really start to ask different questions, and we'll do the breakout groups. So for revitalization of the Semiahmoo language is of the utmost important to have audiovisual. We've been talking about doing a language revitalization within Semiahmoo and streaming, having whether a live streaming or having recordings that we can hold in our community. Unfortunately, we can't even meet in our community facilities right now, but hopefully soon enough. But how has the language evolved and how has it changed? Some of our old language speakers, they spoke from a different place. Even the gaps that have happened through generations. We don't even live in the same world that the old people in. Even when this country was developed 150 years ago, we're not in that world anymore. And the language that we use and the language that we've created to live in this world, a simple word is I was laughing because we were going through some of the dialogue one day, and there's the word for automobile, and I laughed and I thought, well, how would we ever have that? No, that's the evolution of language over time. They had another one in there for slippers, and yet again, that was an evolution of our language, because it's the growth and it's the how we've grown into. But really and why I talk about language revitalization so much is because our language is our connection to our ancestry, our history, but also it's our connection to our land. Our language, in comparison to English, is very feeling orientated, much like several other languages in the world. But it's based around our connectedness. Even here on a virtual screen, we still have somewhat of a connection, and to be able to maintain that connection and hold that connection. we really try to hold our language, and through some of the documentation that's happened through the generations, we've been able to hold on to some of that connection to our long elders. They're long gone. And, still be able to maintain a connection pre-contact, which is vital for our existence. It's vital to the importance. And a lot of people say, you should leave that. That's not who you are anymore. No, that with the tools of today make us very, very wealthy people. And I'm not talking monetary value. I'm talking a richness in knowledge and connectedness and sharing. I think one of the things that we as First Nations people, I'll say it, I think for a long time, I know for a long time, a lot of our elders, and I won't speak specifically for my culture, but I know several other cultures too, that they were worried that if we shared too much, we would be giving away too much. And definitely we've found a happy balance between what we hold on to and we hold sacred just for our own children and grandchildren, and then what we share with the community. But my elder used to say, we may never fit completely in that box because we come from a cyclical worldview. Everything comes back around. So we may never fit in that box. So we need to learn to work in parallel with these. And First Nations issues and Indigenous revitalization, whether through Truth and Reconciliation or UNDRIP, are avenues for us to be able to have our voice. And I think that's really an important place to be. And we've never, here's an example. I've never become a Canadian citizen. I've never acknowledged that I'm not Semiahmoo. I'm Canadian. And I say, no, I'm Semiahmoo. I'm not, I'm Semiahmoo. Semiahmoo predates Canada, where, and I'll use Ulee as an example. You came here and you did your oath. I'm going to become a Canadian, and that's, and be proud of that. Be proud of that. And I'm proud that I say I'm Semiahmoo. They say, where are you from? Well, I'm from the country that's Canada, but I'm Semiahmoo. I don't acknowledge myself, and lots of other First Nations do it the same way. This is who I am first. Secondary, I'm over here. So there's my soapbox. I'll get off of it for now.
Thank you very much, Chief. Yeah, I think you explained it beautifully. Language is part of our identity, and it's also evolving just as our identity is. So yeah, we are now closing. We are almost at 1 hour. I think this was a very vivid, interesting talk. I have to admit, I was a bit nervous initially because I am not very familiar with the topic of heritage, but I think it went well. I would like to close with a quote by Jacques Derrida, who said that there is no political power without control of the archive, if not of memory. Effective democratization can always be measured by this essential criterion: the participation in and the access to the archives, its constitution and its interpretation. So I believe that when we wonder about how and why it is important that we preserve heritage and our culture and our history, we have to also understand that the memory of our history is reflective of our democracy, and those are intertwined. Preserving democracy is just as important as preserving our history and our culture and heritage. Okay, thank you very much to all of you. Letitia, Chief Chappell, Hugh, and Bill for being here tonight. I had a good time. I hope you did too.
Yes.
And thanks for everyone who watched tonight's talk. If you have the chance, please visit the Museum of Surrey and visit the exhibition. I'm going to do that. Yeah, so thank you and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.